Understanding schools from an activity theory perspective.
The U.S. pre-K-12 education system appears to be in a state of continuous crisis. We see the symptoms everywhere: declining student attendance, significant budget shortfalls, and a widening gap between the competencies of recent graduates and the actual demands of the modern workforce. Historically, policymakers used reductionist behaviorism, relying on a linear assumption: a teacher transmits knowledge directly to a student. This model treats learning as an isolated variable, measured by a single metric. But this model fails by ignoring the invisible structural pressures that dictate performance. When an educational system relies on individual-level causal attribution, it inevitably starts assigning blame to isolated individuals, a struggling student or a failing teacher, rather than diagnosing the flawed architecture that surrounds them. Resolving the friction paralyzing our schools requires a shift in our unit of analysis. We must move away from the isolated individual and instead analyze the entire system of relations. This brings us to a strategic alternative for educational stakeholders: cultural historical activity theory, or CHAT. CHAT operates on a specific premise. To understand human behavior, you cannot look at a single data point. You must view that behavior as a part of a collective activity system. This is Yrjö Engström's 1987 activity theory model. Mapping these specific nodes allows observers to visualize the invisible social structures governing learning. Viewing schools through this framework identifies persistent friction among participants as a structural issue, not a collection of individual failures. Embracing systemic mediation provides a roadmap for stakeholders to move past reactive fixes and analyze the specific pressures governing their schools. The theoretical lineage of this model begins with psychologist Lev Vygotsky and his concept of mediated action. Vygotsky established that human behavior is never a simple, direct response to an environmental stimulus. Instead, every action we take is filtered through mediators. To build the model, we start on the left with the subject, the individual, like a student, whose motives drive the action. On the right is their object, the specific goal their activity is directed toward, like mastering a new math curriculum. Crucially, the student and the learning process do not touch directly. They are bridged by cultural artifacts. These are the mediating artifacts. Sitting at the top of the triangle, they represent the tools required to bridge the gap between the student and their objective. In a classroom, these tools take many forms, including physical instruments like laptop computers and textbooks, as well as conceptual signs like language, grading rubrics, and the teacher's localized instructions. Without identifying the specific cultural tools a student relies on, it is impossible to accurately evaluate their progress toward the learning object. But activity does not occur in a vacuum. In 1987, Yrjö Engström expanded Vygotsky's triangle, recognizing that student activity occurs within a societal base. He added this base to the diagram to map the invisible social structures that support and govern traditional mediating tools. First, on the bottom left, are the rules. These dictate exactly how participants are allowed to interact. They encompass explicit mandates, like federal testing standards, and implicit behavioral policies of the local school. Next is the community node. This represents the broader social context of participants who share the educational object. It includes peer groups, the school board, parents, and other mediating community stakeholders. Finally, on the bottom right, we have the division of labor. This node manages both the horizontal distribution of tasks and the vertical hierarchy of power. Here, specific roles and responsibilities are distributed among operational and administrative personnel. The ultimate outcome of the activity depends on how these 6 nodes align. When synchronized, the system moves effectively toward its shared object-directed outcome. The system is defined by recursive mediation. Participants here are not passive recipients of institutional gravity. They actively shape the nodes they occupy. A student might repurpose a tool in unforeseen ways. A teacher might actively re-engineer a rigid state rule to fit their classroom's cultural reality. This creates intense complexity, largely due to multi-positionality, the reality that individuals occupy shifting dual roles within the activity system simultaneously. Consider a teacher. During a lesson, they are the central subject of their own instruction. But from the student's perspective, that same teacher operates as a social mediator located within the student's distinct community node. Because every participant brings distinct cultural histories to these shifting roles, their object-directed actions may misalign. In such a complex system, structural friction is pervasive. In standard management theory, tension is viewed as operational failure, but in activity theory, institutional tension is the primary engine for change. Threats to the system's harmony manifest as structural challenges, categorized as 4 specific types of contradictions. The first is a primary contradiction. This is a conflict within a single node. For example, a student values an AI tool for its use in learning, but the teacher relies on that same tool's system-generated timestamp to grade participation. The utility of the tool conflicts with its exchange value. A secondary contradiction occurs as conflict between 2 separate internal nodes. Consider an external economic shock, like a budget deficit, that alters the rules node by mandating larger class sizes. This clashes directly with the tools node, which still mandates a curriculum requiring time-intensive individual remediation. A tertiary contradiction occurs when new practices challenge established cultural norms, like a labor union filing a grievance because new software disrupts existing contract protocols. Finally, a quaternary contradiction is a misalignment across entirely neighboring systems, like when a school outputs graduates lacking the technical skills demanded by the corporate workplace. Leaving these contradictions unresolved ensures systemic gridlock. We see the outputs clearly: unprepared young citizens entering the workforce, frustrated educators, and a community at odds with its schools. To understand the psychological toll on educators, we have to look closer at that secondary contradiction, the clash between increased class sizes and the requirement for individual remediation. Activity theorists identify the result of this structural dilemma as a double bind, where the subject receives severely conflicting demands. If the teacher uses the remediation tool to help struggling students, they violate the new pacing rules. If they adhere to the pacing rules to satisfy administrative mandates, they must abandon the remediation tool entirely. Individual heroics do not resolve double binds. The system's own structural parameters block operational success. When an educational system reaches this tipping point, stakeholders are faced with only 2 options: allow the system to collapse or deliberately re-engineer their survival. In activity theory, resolving systemic contradictions requires a collaborative intervention known as expansive learning. Expansive learning is a deliberate process where system actors step out of their silos, analyze their constraints, and collectively design changes to their practice. Since the rule mandating 35 students is locked, stakeholders must redesign the system. First, they alter the tools, integrating AI to automate routine remediation. Second, they shift the division of labor, dismantling the solo teacher model to implement peer-to-peer tutoring. This relies on a mechanism called shifting. Community members, in this case students, move horizontally along the diagram to assume specialized labor roles, actively distributing the heavy instructional load. This structural realignment resolves the contradiction and breaks the double bind, freeing up human mediation to focus on complex socio-emotional support and critical thinking. Sustainable reform requires moving past reactive fixes. By mapping these complex mediational networks, communities are empowered to re-engineer their systems from within. Going forward, we will apply activity theory in our work to understand U.S. pre-K-12 schools and seek possibilities for positive change.
Thank you for watching, and we look forward to having you join in our discussions.